Can we all see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, so I figured I would share some of the key things I learned on my degree. And it turns out that the thing that really stuck with me was probably the most simple thing, which is opportunity cost. If this slide changes. Oh, yeah. I also had way too much fun with the animations. So there might be a few of them. So yeah, opportunity cost is essentially the value of the next best alternative when you make a decision. So this can apply to anything. So an obvious one is time versus money. You know, if you don't work, then you're sacrificing, you get the time back, but you lose the money that you would have earned. And then another one that comes up recently is the treating COVID situation, whereas a lot of general tech checkups are going undone, or getting pushed to the side. So the next best alternative would be doing the general checkups maybe, but they're not happening. So you have to weigh up every decision with the cost that it might incur. So that's also the case when it comes to drugs. With if anyone's heard of NICE, I don't know what it stands for. I know it's the government's, it's what they use to regulate medicine. But whenever they choose one medicine, essentially they're saying, well, we put resources to this one, we can't afford the other one. So there's always, it's essentially trade-off. But yeah, I use it all the time. So it's a good thing to, if you're thinking about buying something, it really makes you think about whether you really need it, because you could be using it for something else. But it really fits into the next point, which is the opportunity cost of business bailouts versus creative destruction, which could have happened. So creative destruction is, I'll go on to the next slide. Essentially, where new technologies, there can be new products, methods of production. Essentially, it's innovation, but it's where that essentially erodes existing market power. So it doesn't have to be eroding existing market power, but that's one example of it. So Schumpeter, I think that's how you say it. This guy came up with the creative destruction argument. So he believed that you shouldn't judge a monopoly based on the fact that they own the market. So you take Amazon, let's say Google, all of these big companies. Monopolies are generally thought to be inefficient, but because I guess the creative destruction, or the internal fear of it, makes them push to be innovative. So yeah, as long as there are open markets, monopolies are transient, so they will come and go. There's always somebody willing to be innovative in their thoughts. So yeah, this is essentially, you can see here, it's just a definition of an entrepreneur. Like, he was pretty smart for his time. I think he was around in like 1920 or something, died in 1950. But yeah, it fits so many of the current day trends. So here's all the push-pull things, but I'll leave that. And next we have, so essentially his theory is innovation comes in waves. So I'll stick to the ones where actually, let's stick to the ones where almost knew when I was born. So the digital networks, so the dot-com boom, the innovation around that, it starts off low and then it boosts up. And then we're currently in a renewable energy kind of wave with circular economy, hydrogen and stuff like that. So it's a theory that with business cycles, when there's a recession, that kind of kills off the incumbent firms, and then the innovative companies kind of push their way through. So yeah, why is this good for us essentially? So it is estimated to be responsible for around 50% of the growth in the economy. 25 to 50% depending on, there's tons of studies and it's economics, they all contradict each other. But so it tends to be most visible in the aftermath of economic dislocation, so recessions, and possibly at the moment, we've had a lot of issues with COVID. So hopefully this will help show opportunities in the economy. So Yeah, COVID has magnified weaknesses and exposed opportunities. It's argued that it's like the biggest kind of shock since the Second World War. So yeah, so as a result, it's accelerated creative destruction. So yeah, the development of new technologies, remote working have really been pushed forward. Yeah, little company here, if you don't know if you've heard of them, Househack. Yeah, so I've got a question for you guys. Who do you think are like the winners and losers at the moment of creative destruction, or will be the winners and losers?
I reckon like big oil and fossil fuel companies will definitely be losers unless they change.
Yeah, that's a good point. Charlie?
Yeah, I think that's very true in terms of the fossil fuels. And I think we even saw that quite immediately, should we say, from the lack of transport, the lack of movement, but also in the long term in terms of the adoption of renewables this year has been absolutely crazy looking at the stats. So it's definitely been a great winner, is also the renewable energy industry in the long term. Technology, of course, anything cloud-based, anything that allows us to connect, Zoom, anything is a winner in the long term with this. And any company that can adopt that technology, I think there's a really cool graph that we've seen that it's like, oh, who led the creative or the adoption of technology in your market or in your company? It's like 6% CEO, 6% CTO, and it's like what 98 or 88% COVID. So it's like, okay, the digital transformation is here because of a pandemic, because it's been forced upon us. And I think anything that adopts that and sees it in the long term as part of a hybrid strategy at the very least is the winner. And anyone that sees it as going back to normal, i.e. come back to office, you've got 5 days a week, it'll go back to fun and games, it's going to lose out massively going forward.
Yeah, no, I agree. So these are the examples that I came up with. I think there's other ones. If you think of, genomics is here. I don't know if that is how you say the word, but the way they've been pushing out the COVID vaccines, I was reading recently that they think that will help push forward future medical advances in everything, essentially. So cancer is the one I was reading about. But yeah, that was just a quick presentation. I rushed through that, it seems. So I shall stop sharing.
Okay, I've got a good question for you. With the previous recessions, with the previous kind of stimulus for creative destruction, perhaps there was more of an underlying cause within the economy that led to a recession that then led to the innovation and change. With something like a pandemic right now, where it's very much an external market shock that's almost just happened out of the blue, out of nowhere, how much change in terms of this time round is being forced upon us in the long term rather than the short term because of that, in the sense that, okay, we've just had a recession because of this external shock rather than because of the whole banking system's collapsed. Like, it's a different kind of cause, and how much does the cause affect the outcome in terms of the innovation?
I think it comes down to challenging the status quo. So anything that kind of forces the incumbents to change their practices should, in theory, lead to long-term growth. But there's always the like researching this again, there's also the theories that innovation is an iterative process, so that we need incomes and stuff like that. So it's an interesting argument. But yeah, I think it will be good. I'm trying to take the positive argument that, there is some good to come out of the COVID pandemic, and hopefully it'll drive forward innovation. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, I think it did. Thank you.
Yeah. The reason I had it as opportunity cost is it depends what your opinion is on the government, but they're bailing out businesses at the moment, essentially. And will that prevent, firms that needed to die? Will it keep them alive?
Yeah,
is an interesting view, like potentially. Ryan, do you have a question?
Yeah, I don't really know what my question is, but the kind of commentary that I come at it from of when you talk about the waves and introduction of innovation or the phases of innovation. when you ask the question about like who wins and who loses. And I think also links to what Izzy just said about big oil might be actually one to lose for once. Whereas my response to what your question was around who's going to win is it's the classic, it's people with capital, right? So if you've got a failing business and you're not getting supported by government, you're probably going to fail. You're going to go bankrupt. If you are a company like us who are kind of coming up trying to do things a little bit differently, won't be too long really before you get on a VC's radar and you've got 25k checks coming your way because they're just throwing money about because they themselves have either got government funding or they've had recent success because market seems to be not responding as badly as they should because the stimulus across the world seems to be propping that up. So I can't help but think the whole market everywhere is overextended in that way, which trickles back right the way down, or theoretically it should.
Yeah.
In a venture capital way, it does definitely. Whether that's equal or not is another conversation. But I think the ultimate takeaway from me is that COVID has exposed the inequality within the market system that we have. And so if you've got capital, great. If you don't, then you're fucked, basically. So I don't see that that's linked in the same way to innovation as you're not necessarily arguing, but kind of talking about them in the same way, I think is a challenge because obviously there's a lot of market innovation that's happening right now as a result of COVID, which is leading to the acquisition of capital and growth of a company. But at the same time, I think we're also seeing a massive increase across wealth inequality because you can't afford to take certain actions if you haven't got, on an individual level, savings, for example. On a business level, you don't have investments to prop up your business because you've got no income for 12 months or 9 months or whatever.
Yeah.
Or if you're in that gap of self-employed, for example, who've had no furlough, no government support, you can't furlough yourself, then you've had no income, you're going to go bankrupt. And that's, I feel, the government's decision, or through their various policy decisions, indirectly, whether they meant it or not, doesn't matter. They've left a certain number of businesses to go bankrupt, which is what you said to your point of, were they just going to die anyway, kind of thing. So yeah, kind of rounding that point off in terms of inequality, and is the whole system overextended through the stimulus, or is it back to what Charlie said of actually the economic system responded much more quickly in a much more unified way than in 2007-8, and actually will be better off for that response in the long term? That's not really a question. I just sort of throwing random thoughts out.
Yeah, so what you're saying, yeah, no, it's a good point. It's a really that's the thing.
There's no right answer. Like,
everything links together so much. So you'll have a theory and it'll look good on the surface, and then as soon as you just point, you can pick holes in it constantly, essentially. So yeah, creative destruction, you say it accounts for 50%, but it could be 25%. That's a pretty big difference when you think about it. But yeah, I was going to ask, do you think the growth is going to come from small businesses that are the incumbents? So are they going to grow? So businesses that are already together before pandemic, or new startups? Like, do you think which one do you think is better suited to the future growth? Stunned silence. Yeah, I don't know if I can answer. It's just a personal opinion. Like, it's interesting to just kind of think about where the future's going, because it is really difficult to predict after like a shock like this.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I think my response would be just brand new businesses or small businesses that are adaptable enough to change within COVID, that I think are in a position to sell themselves for investment quickly. So like, you looked at all of that, you looked at genomics, you looked at like all of those different ones, right? Every single one of those industries is in such a phase of growth that the long-term investment will likely pay off, but actually the short-term investment is still really, really highly capitally intensive, because ultimately those industries are highly technologically reliant, and the investments in those technologies to make those technologies cheaper and more widely accessible is massive. So you're not going to have a small business that bootstraps in genomics that suddenly blows up, I'll be very surprised.
Yeah.
You'll have VC-backed funds that go, all right, we're going to invest in the next upcoming 25, 100, 500 genomic startups. We're going to give them 500 grand each, see what happens. Like that's how typically the whole process works. You know, you get laddered up, you get more money,
Yeah. Do you think there's VC funding out there now? Because generally during a recession, VC funding kind of dries up a little bit.
See, that's what I don't understand about how markets work in. I don't understand. I'm not an economics graduate, but yeah, 100%. There's so much money out there, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like and I know that that's the space that I'm plugged into even a little bit. But whether it's Twitter, Clubhouse, LinkedIn, across just social media alone.
But no, if you look at the IPOs this year, there's been more
IPOs. There just seems to be a ridiculous amount of money out there. And I think part of that is linked to government stimulus and things like this, but there just seems to be an unbelievable amount of money out there for businesses, not necessarily for people. Like you look in the States, you've got the stimulus checks that are going to be potentially approved. They seem to be spending ages on approving the bill of like £2,000 per person. But then equally, you look on the flip side of that, you've got businesses IPOing for billions and billions. Bumble last week, even Tesla, thinking about them over the last year, like their stock has gone up by like 700% or something. Everything just seems to be overextended. But yeah, I'll shut up now.
Wait, Lily, you study economics, right? Do you think market bubble at the moment, based on what Ryan's saying?
Definitely. And it's kind of interesting to hear like inflation's been kind of like going up and it's a bubble, it's going to burst soon, it's going bad, and negative interest rates, all that. So, but also like been doing a project on challenger banks kind of this semester, and it's interesting, they don't actually get any government funding through COVID, but they're like the new startup online banks and things like that. So I feel like Ryan said, it is very unequal who gets what money, and obviously smaller banks and things and businesses need more money because they can't take that risk, because with bigger banks they take 4 risks and 3 out of them fail, and the 4th one that works makes them loads of money, and small businesses just can't afford to do that. So yeah.
That's a good question. So Ryan was talking about it being equitable, like fair, but should the allocation of funds be fair? So it's a moral question, because you want the most efficient business to survive for the economy to thrive.
But then like you look at Amazon, for example, they didn't make any profit in the first 3 years, or Netflix, they didn't make any profit. So is that the best resources and the most profitable business out there though?
That's true. Yeah, you can't see it until they get to a certain stage. No, it's interesting. It's difficult.
Yeah.
I had a question. I know very little about economics, but I was just wondering if you thought that innovation was only possible through this like creative destruction, or is there like space in the market for innovation without destruction?
Definitely without it. I think it's heavily linked to capital. So big firms tend to invest more with R&D. I think the big spurts need this kind of destruction process. But then again, it only accounts for 25%, which 25 to 50. So the rest of it's got to come from somewhere.
Where else can it come from? Just out of interest.
Good question. So iterative process. So you've got these big pharma companies that invest billions each year. They may not see the gain. They won't see the gains each year, but suddenly they will have this massive discovery. That's the other theory that kind of contradicts the Schumpeter guy of creative destruction.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, innovation tends to come from smaller businesses as well. People challenging the status quo. That's the issue, not the issue, but that's the argument of creative destruction, is that monopolies will only survive if they are innovative. So you've got Amazon, Apple, all the big ones. They've been around for ages and they don't seem to have any.
Don't they have like so much money that they can always be innovating? So they can always be like hiring new people with new ideas.
And that's the thing.
Are they ever going to not be the monopolies?
When I was researching this, so like most firms are going to be cutting back their investment, but Apple, Amazon, they'll be investing like nothing's happened because nothing has happened to them essentially. When you look at their at least their stock, you know, their stocks are constantly going up, revenues are going up. I think Apple's now back at brand leader on the phones. Maybe that's by sales volume. I don't know. I just saw an article title. So
yeah, sales volume.
Yeah, sales volume. Yeah.
Do you think that it's possible for small businesses to innovate and be successful within that, but not eventually be sold or be acquired?
Okay, so what in organic growth rather than kind of thing.
So like the standard process as a small business owner, if you're successful and you're innovating, it's as part of the incentive behind that, you need to sell, you need to IPO, or you need to be acquired in order to be rewarded for that.
100% of equity, kind of.
Kind of. I don't want to complicate the question too much, but I'm trying to compare market incentive and personal incentive, by which some of that inequity that we see of, you know, your Apple can shield themselves against COVID because they've got 4 billion cash pile or whatever, versus Monzo, who have had no funding from the government or whatever, as the kind of challenger bank example. Well, theoretically, even if Monzo keep growing, they keep innovating, they're going to have to IPO, or they're going to have to be acquired by somebody to continue to innovate if they haven't got that support there. Does that make sense as a question?
Oh, generally, because you're investing with retained profits, so you're limited with that, you know, capital, unless you can get business loans. Would be my lower levels of gearing. So yeah,
that's fine. Thanks.
Not that I know, you know, I studied it for a degree. I just find this stuff interesting. Like, I'm definitely not an expert in any of it. I found, I only graduated last year, but I found out how much I forgot, like, researching this again. It's crazy.
Yeah, you know, it's amazing how much you can like have learned in your degree and then pick up again quite quickly, though, even though you perhaps revisited it. So that's definitely part of it. But yeah, really, really appreciate going through this, Sammy. Really useful as a conversation and something to get the brain whirling again in terms of innovation, where it comes from, what starts it, who can do it, where does it even lead to? Like a lot of questions to start us on a good thinking discovery, should we say. So yeah, really appreciate your time going through this, and of course the questions for everyone as well. Really great stuff. And I don't know if anyone else has any closing words, but I think that's pretty much it from today. Nice. Okay, I'll pause and record.